Ladies and gentlemen, in a quiet corner of Georgia, nestled deep in the whispering pines, stood a farmhouse so ordinary it was almost invisible, and inside it lived an elderly black woman the world had long overlooked. She was soft-spoken, kind, and alone, or so it seemed. To the townsfolk, she was just Miss Thelma, the sweet lady with the best pies in 3 counties. But behind her gentle smile lay a life woven with secrets, silence, and scars earned in places no map marks. Tonight I'm going to share with you a story that begins in stillness, erupts in chaos, and returns, like all legends do, to quiet again. And when we reach the end, you'll realize it never really ended at all. It simply flowed back to where it began. The woman in the whispering pines deep in the rural belly of Georgia, where cracked dirt roads vanish into endless pine forests, and every creak of wood feels like it carries a ghost. There stood an old farmhouse, forgotten by time, remembered by no one but the land. It was there that Miss Thelma Grace Holloway lived, to the townsfolk miles away. She was the kind old black woman who sold sweet potato pies at the market, always wearing a faded shawl and a knowing smile. They said she'd lost her husband decades ago, and that grief made her quiet, but no one ever visited, no kids, no mail, no visitors, and no one dared to ask why the American flag on her porch never faded, or why, some nights, strange lights blinked in her fields, then vanished like ghosts. She lived alone, or so it seemed. What the town didn't know was that Thelma wasn't just part of the land. She was part of a secret the land was still guarding. Predators at the door, it was a night without stars, the sky choked with storm clouds, and the air wet with coming rain. Inside the farmhouse, Miss Thelma sat in a rocking chair by the fireplace, sipping tea, eyes half, lidded but sharp. Then came the knock, 3 times, hard and impatient. She didn't move, didn't flinch. Outside, under the veil of darkness, 3 men in black hoodies exchanged glances. They weren't travelers, they weren't lost. They were wolves who'd heard whispers of an old woman living alone, far from help, with rumored savings stashed under creaky floorboards. Easy prey, Kenny checked his pistol, Blaze wiped sweat off his lip. Duke, the leader, gave a nod. The plan was simple. Charm if needed, force if not. But when the door opened and they saw Miss Thelma standing there calm, composed, eyes steady, it sent a chill through them. Because prey isn't supposed to look back at you like a predator waiting for the first mistake. The calm before the storm, the men stepped inside, their boots tracking mud onto the old wooden floors. Thelma didn't flinch. Her hands rested gently on the arms of her rocking chair, her teacup still warm. Duke swaggered toward her, flashing a crooked smile. "We don't want trouble, Grandma, just a little something to help us out." Kenny disappeared into the kitchen, while Blaze drew the curtains, darkening the room. Still, Thelma didn't move. Instead, she looked up with a quiet confidence, her voice smooth as warm syrup. "You boys don't know what house you've walked into." That line made Duke pause. He'd heard fear in 100 voices, but this woman's voice didn't tremble. It warned. It hinted, it dared. She sat there, an unshaken figure in a storm that hadn't started yet, as if she was waiting for something, and indeed she was. Because predators think silence means fear. But sometimes it's just the stillness before all hell breaks loose. The code that woke the sky without another word, Miss Thelma leaned over and picked up an old rotary phone from a nearby table. An antique Dusty, the kind people kept for decoration. Blaze chuckled. "You serious with that thing?" But Thelma didn't answer him. She dialed each number slowly, deliberately, with hands that moved like they'd memorized 1,000 secret codes. A faint click echoed from the receiver, followed by a short tone. Then, with a voice that transformed from grandmotherly to commanding, she said, "Code, Holloway, Delta 37, immediate extraction, package compromised." The silence that followed was electric. Duke's grin vanished. Kenny froze in the kitchen, Blaze's face drained of color. What the hell did she just say? He whispered. That's when they heard it. A distant chopped, chop in the sky like thunder that had found rhythm. The ground began to vibrate. Their plan was unraveling fast, and in that moment they realized this wasn't just an old lady in an old house. This was a trigger, and they had just pulled it. Thunder in the sky, eyes in the dark, the distant hum grew louder, no longer ignorable, no longer abstract. The men rushed to the window, eyes wide with disbelief. Cutting through the cloud, heavy sky came a sleek, black helicopter, military, grayed, unmarked, and terrifyingly precise. Its searchlights lit up the farmhouse like a stage. The force of the rotors bent the trees and kicked dust into the air. Blaze stumbled back. "This can't be real," he muttered, shielding his eyes. Kenny dropped the drawer he was rummaging through. Duke cursed under his breath, his bravado crumbling. The farmhouse wasn't isolated anymore. It was surrounded by an invisible perimeter. A red laser dot flicked across the wall. The air was suddenly heavy with precision and power. Miss Thelma stood at the center of the storm, her shawl fluttering in the draft, completely unmoved. "You came here thinking I was alone," she said, voice calm as gospel. "But baby, I haven't been alone in decades. The wolves get hunted. The door burst open with surgical force. 6 figures in black tactical gear moved in like shadows with purpose. No shouting, no chaos, just swift, trained execution. Blaze reached for his weapon but never got the chance. A red beam marked his chest, and he was tackled before he could breathe. Kenny made a break for the back door and was instantly met with a flashbang that dropped him to his knees. Duke lifted his hands, shaking, face pale, stammering We didn't know. But the lead operator didn't care. Orders were orders, targets secured, area clear. The voice was mechanical, devoid of emotion. Miss Thelma finally stood, her back straight, eyes steady. The leader of the unit turned toward her and saluted. "Colonel Holloway, perimeter is locked. Extraction team at your service." And in that moment the illusion shattered. Thelma wasn't just a sweet old woman with pie recipes. She was a legend hidden in plain sight, and tonight her past had come roaring back in blades and boots. The salute to a ghost as the dust settled and the robbers lay cuffed and silent. Reality began to set in. These men had planned to rob a helpless old woman, but what they had walked into was a battlefield disguised as a living room. One by one, the operatives removed their helmets. Their eyes didn't scan the farmhouse. They focused on her. With military precision and deep respect, the entire team stood straight and saluted in unison. Colonel Holloway, the commander, repeated, "Your orders, ma'am." For a moment Thelma said nothing. She looked at the 3 intruders like a teacher examining poor students. "You're lucky," she said softly. "I've buried men for less." Duke looked up, fear etched into every line of his face. 100 questions sat on his tongue, but not one could be spoken, because no answer would have explained how this frail old woman commanded warriors like gods. Not one word could make sense of the fact that they had just tried to rob a ghost of the battlefield. Justice in the shadows, the men were led out one by one, hands zip-tied, eyes wide with disbelief. They weren't going to jail, not yet, not the way they thought. The operatives loaded them onto a secondary chopper. No markings, no explanations. "Where are you taking us?" Blaze screamed. No answer. Just silence, controlled, tactical silence. Back inside, Thelma stood alone now, watching them disappear into the clouds. She reached for the photo above her fireplace, a younger version of herself in uniform, medals shining on her chest, standing beside a Delta unit in a faraway desert. She traced her fingers across it, then returned to her chair. Outside, not even the wind dared disturb the moment. What had just happened wouldn't make the news. There would be no paperwork, no courtrooms. Because justice, for people like Thelma Grace Holloway, had always lived in the shadows, quiet, exact, and absolute. And tonight it had answered her call one last time. A quiet return to smoke and spice by sunrise, the farmhouse was once again wrapped in calm. No rotor blades, no shouts, no shadows in the woods. Just the chirping of birds and the smell of pine in the warm southern air. The townspeople never saw a helicopter, never heard a shot, and Miss Thelma. She showed up that Sunday morning with her usual crate of pies at the town market, her shawl draped across her shoulders, her soft voice greeting children and neighbors alike. No one asked where she'd been the night before. No one dared. Some noticed her eyes were a little sharper that day. Others thought she moved with a touch more purpose, but they dismissed it as imagination. After all, she was just Miss Thelma, the pie lady. Nothing more. They didn't know that just hours earlier she'd been called Colonel by a secret world that had once bent to her command, and they never would. Legends never die. They just get quieter. A little boy at the market pulled gently on Miss Thelma's dress. "Miss Thelma," he asked, "were you ever in the army?" Thelma looked down at him and smiled. Not the kind of smile you give to brush something off, but the kind that says, "If only you knew." She crouched slightly, her voice soft but firm. "Something like that, baby." Then she handed him a warm slice of pie and winked. The boy ran off none the wiser. Behind her, the wind whispered through the oaks like an old friend. The world had moved on, but legends like her didn't need monuments or medals. They lived in the spaces no one looked, in the silence after justice, in the shadow of stories never told. Miss Thelma returned to her chair that night, her mission done, and in the quiet she rocked. As a warrior who had once again defended her ground without ever raising her voice, and so, with the wind carrying away the last echoes of rotor blades and danger long dissolved into the red Georgia soil, Miss Thelma returned to her life. Her chair by the window, her cat by the fire, her pies at the market. To the world she remained the quiet old woman at the end of a dirt road, but now we know better. She was not forgotten. She was never helpless. She was the kind of force that doesn't ask for recognition because she doesn't need it. She lived her truth in the shadows, served her country in silence, and stood her ground with grace. And if you ever find yourself driving down a lonely Georgia road and you pass an old white farmhouse with a flag that's never faded, remember this: that's not just a home, that's where legends rest. Where the past watches, and where a whispering pine still guards a name no one dares forget: Miss Thelma Grace Holloway, the ghost the world almost missed.